Hello everyone, Poohead189 here, and today we're going to end my short series on the Battle of Thermopylae by speaking on the very battle itself. A battle that either occurred on the 20th of August and ended on the 22nd, or began September 8th through the 10th in a 3-day face-off. Now I'm going to assume you saw my previous video detailing the events before the battle, but just to give a small bit of info, you need to realize that whatever date the battle was fought on, the Persians and the Greeks faced one another without fighting for 5 days beforehand. The Greeks, around 5,000 strong according to Herodotus, as you see on this chart, held the pass of Thermopylae. Diodorus Siculus says that there were over 7,000 Greeks, but his numbers are most likely wrong for numerous reasons. The Persians themselves had around 250,000 men at their disposal, though perhaps as little as 60,000 were attacking during the battle. So, with over 5,000 Greeks facing the Persians and only 300 Spartans there, why are the Spartans so famous? Well, I will explain. The first and most obvious reason is that Leonidas and his Spartans were the leaders of the Greeks. Every Greek there followed the Spartans' lead, not only because of their fearsome reputation, but because they were the hegemons of all Greece, being the most powerful Greek city-state. So that essentially meant that they had the most influence in Greece. So, when the Persians arrived, King Xerxes had in his presence at least two brothers, Abrochromes and Hyperanthes, who actually both died in the fighting, and it shows just how fearsome the battle was if two of the king's brothers got mixed up in the melee and died. The king might consider his brothers rivals to be watched, but they would still be under guard even on the battlefield. Xerxes also had in his court an exiled king of Sparta called Demiratus, who was there to advise the king. As I said in my last video on Thermopylae, Persia was a favorite place to go for exiles. The great king always had people of interest and knowledge to advise him. King Demiratus had already warned Xerxes of the nature of his previous subjects of Sparta, the Lacedaemonians, but the king had laughed this off. Now, when the Persians had arrived, the king sent a scout forward to check out the Greek forces. And I'll read from Herodotus here. In the midst of their deliberations, Xerxes sent a scout on horseback to spy out their number, and to see what they were up to. Xerxes had already heard, while still in Thessaly, that a tiny force had assembled in the pass, led by the Lacedaemonians under Leonidas, and that Leonidas was of the bloodline of Heracles. The horseman came galloping up to the camp and duly made his survey, although not of the whole camp, since it was impossible for him to see most of the troops who were stationed behind the wall, which they had repaired and were now garrisoning. Instead, the scout took stock of the men who were out in the open, with their arms and armor piled up in front of the wall, and who at the time, as it happened, were the Lacedaemonians. And Lacedaemonian means Spartans and the people who lived immediately around the city-state. That place was called Laconia. Some of the men, who the scout saw to his astonishment, were exercising naked, and some were combing their hair. Keeping his eyes peeled, however, he added up their numbers, and then once he had arrived at an accurate total, galloped off unhindered. Rather than pursuing him, everyone treated him with the utmost indifference, so he went back to Xerxes and reported all he had seen. The king, though, was unable to appreciate the significance of what he was hearing, namely that the Lacedaemonians were readying themselves to be killed, and to kill in turn as many as they were able. To Xerxes their actions seemed laughable, and so, because he wished to make sense of them, he summoned Demiratus, the son of Ariston, who was there in the camp. After he had duly arrived, Xerxes asked him to explain, point by point, the behavior of the Lacedaemonians. "You've already heard me discuss these men," Demiratus said, "when we were setting out for Greece, and when you heard what I had to say, you laughed at my forecast of how events in this campaign would unfold, but that was because, O king, when I am in your presence, I have no greater object or aim than to be truthful with you. So hear me out again. These men have come here to fight us for the pass, and they are getting themselves ready to do just that. It is their custom, you see, whenever they are about to risk their lives, to dress their hair. But rest assured, should you defeat them and their fellows still in Sparta, my king, then no other people in the world will take up arms against you and stand in your path, for you are about to attack the fairest kingdom in all of Greece. Yes, and the bravest men." The king then sent an ambassador to speak to the Greeks, once he had spoken to Demiratus. When Xerxes sent the Persian emissary to negotiate with Leonidas, the Greeks were offered their freedom, the title Friends of the Persian People, and the opportunity to resettle on land better than that they possessed, for Xerxes' main targets were the Ionian Greeks and Athens. Xerxes certainly planned on conquering all of Greece, but he only wanted to just utterly destroy Athens. The Spartans and the other Greeks under them refused, however, and when Xerxes heard, Xerxes sent a written message asking them to lay down their weapons. Leonidas sent back a message, molon labe, meaning come and take them. Xerxes then waited 4 days, believing the size of his army was so vast that the Greeks, despite the king's insolence, would scatter in fear. When they didn't on the 5th day, Xerxes had waited long enough. Herodotus reads that Xerxes thought Leonidas had impudence and folly, and their continued presence, meaning the Greeks, there were making him seethe with anger, and he sent the Medes and Scythians against them, with orders to take them alive and bring them into his presence. The Medes fell upon the Greeks in a great rush, and although many were slain, others still pressed the attack, and were not driven back despite terrible losses. It was made clear to everyone, however, and not least to the king himself, that for all the mass of humanity under his command, he had only very few real men, and all day long the clash continued. In due course, such was the mauling inflicted on the Medes that they were withdrawn from the attack and replaced by the Persian immortals, as the men under the command of Hydarnes were termed by the king, and who, it was expected, would have no difficulty completing this task. When they joined battle with the Greeks, however, it was the same story, because they were fighting in a confined space, using spears shorter than those wielded by the Greeks, and unable to press home their weight of numbers. They enjoyed no more success than the Median divisions had done. The Lacedaemonians fought in a manner that richly merits description, and left no one in any doubt that, while they were men who really knew what they were about, their opponents were just amateurs in comparison. Every so often, for instance, they would turn tail and give the impression of mass flight, and then, after the barbarians, being the Persians, had raised a cry of triumph at the sight of their retreat, rushed forward to attack them with great hullabaloo and caught up with them. Sorry, I had to turn the page. The Lacedaemonians would wheel round to confront the barbarians, and inflict such terrible damage upon the Persians once they had done so that there was no counting the number who fell. Whenever this happened, the Spartans would suffer their own casualties too, but only a few. The Persians did all they could to force the pass, attacking in formation and in a whole number of other ways too, but it was proved beyond them, and so they retreated. As these waves of battle were surging forwards, the king is said to have been so alarmed for his army, they leapt up 3 times from his throne. Nor the following day did the contest for the pass go any better for the barbarians. Once again they joined battle, confident that the Greeks would have suffered so much damage that, given how few they were, they would no longer have it in them to take up arms. The Greeks, however, had organized themselves by their place of origin into separate divisions, and took it in turns to fight, all except for the Phocians, who had been ordered to take up their station on the mountain to guard the path. When the Persians found things unchanged from the day before, they duly retreated. Xerxes at this point was at a loss at what to do. However, on the night of the 2nd day, Xerxes was approached by a Greek named Ephialtes, who told Xerxes of the 3rd path through Thermopylae. As there were 3 full paths to go through Thermopylae, there was the Goat Path, there was the Hot Gates that they defended, and there was the other road that was then walled off earlier before the battle began. Now, the Goat Path, this 3rd path, guarded by the Phocians. Immediately Xerxes sent a strong force up the path, and it was a surprise to both the Persians and the Phocians when they stumbled into one another in the night. According to Herodotus, the Persians had initially thought the Phocians were Spartans, which scared them. They were wary of any Greek phalanx, but the Lacedaemonians were particularly feared. Simultaneously, the Phocians didn't believe the Persians were there to flank the Greeks. They believed the Persians were there for them. So rather than guard the road, the Phocians grouped together and made for the hill above the road as a defensive position. The Persians paid them no heed, and simply continued down the path after the Phocians had moved. Once the Greeks knew they had been flanked, they held a meeting among the captains. Seeing as it was 2,500 years ago, and no dialogue was written down, we can only surmise their discussion. Some believe the Greeks were uneasy about staying, but did not want to leave if the Spartans stayed. Some say Leonidas dismissed the other Greeks to save their lives, others to hog the glory, and others to tell the Greeks of what happened here. But the Greeks left, all save 300 Spartans, 700 Thespians, and 400 Thebans. The Thespians stayed on their own accord. The Thebans were forced to stay by Leonidas. The reason is because the Greeks suspected, and rightly so, that Thebes had sided with the Persians as many Greek city-states had. But the Spartans were closer, and pressured the Thebans to show their good faith and give 400 men to the cause. Little wonder as to why the Thebans did not fight when the time came, but instead either surrendered or even backstabbed the Spartans and Thespians at the final battle. We can't be sure. And so once again the Persians sent another large force. How many, we can't exactly be certain. Herodotus tells us it was around 10,000 again from the front, with archers and advanced cavalry. As usual, the Spartans led the remaining forces, and the Spartans did what the Persians least expected. Rather than stay in the hot gates, they actually advanced against the Persians. By this point, what spears they had were soon shattered, which led to the most impressive part of the entire battle, and shows just how good the Spartans are. Anyone who knows anything about classical Greek warfare, they know that swords are a secondary, if not tertiary, weapon. The primary weapon is the spear, and arguably the second weapon is the hoplon shield. Greeks are not skilled with the sword. The sword is used only when you have broken another enemy's phalanx and they're too bogged down for them to dodge you stabbing at their unarmored sides. In fact, you could certainly make the argument that a Persian infantryman was on average a better swordsman than a Greek. However, that was not the case with the Spartans. Herodotus doesn't tell us the Spartans fought with their swords. He tells us that the Spartans slaughtered the Persians with their swords. These Spartans, having waded into an enemy formation 20 times their number, if not greater, hacked and slashed their way further into the Persian lines like Hercules himself. The Thespians as well bravely followed. Leonidas led from the front, killing any Persian in his path. This was when Xerxes' two brothers were killed, for they had thought the Greeks so few in number that they would buckle under the Persian attack. That assumption caused the princes their lives. However, eventually, Leonidas himself fell. Reportedly, it was by 2 archers, but we can't be sure. What we do know is that when the king was slain, his body was overrun by Persians, but the Spartans threw themselves on the enemy to regain his body, and after several heroic attempts, they succeeded in recovering the body of Leonidas. It was then the flanking army came around the path, and the Spartans retreated with the other Greeks to the hillock within the pass. The Thebans had deserted them, and the Spartans, some now armed with daggers and the rest with just their fists and teeth, fought to the death. So fierce were they that still the Persians shot arrows at them instead of fighting them whenever they could. Herodotus tells us that after Leonidas fell, the bravest of the Spartans was a man named Dionysus, though we do not know what his heroism was. However, we do know that it was he that came up with the line, "We will fight in the shade," when warned of the Persian arrows blotting out the sun. After him, the next bravest were Alpheus and Meron, 2 Spartan sons of Orsiphantus. The bravest of the Thespians was a man called Dithyrambus, son of Harmatiades. And so, 2,500 years ago, these men fought for the freedom of the Greeks. These men fought for the freedom of free thought. And though the Persians were not an evil, had they conquered Greece, the world would be a far different and likely darker place. Thanks, guys. Have a good one.